Do you ever think about how in New York movies of the 1960s, like The Apartment or The Odd Couple and other non-Jack Lemmon movies, there's this sense of this very glamorous lifestyle, how it's this beautiful metropolitan city, and these guys are all working these really well-to-do white-collar jobs, and they live in these glamorous, spacious apartments. And then just a few years later, I guess maybe starting with like a movie like Midnight Cowboy, suddenly New York is like the worst hellhole you've ever seen. And it gets even worse with movies like Taxi Driver and a lot of sort of like these Fun City era movies from the 70s and on through the early 80s, kind of like that, this Frank Miller nightmare version of New York, really. I don't know why that is. I feel like maybe it has something to do with younger filmmakers coming in and kind of telling the truth, or maybe it's people who actually have lived in the city rather than guys like Billy Wilder, who are probably LA guys who have had a very different view of New York and Manhattan overall. I'm not sure, and it doesn't really have a lot to do with my video today and what we're talking about, but it does sort of set the scene, at least for the first author whose book I spent the last week or so reading, who is Lawrence Block. I have been wanting to read Lawrence Block's Matthew Scudder stories for a while now, partially because they're very well received. Block had written about 17 of these along with a few others. The Matthew Scudder series is a private eye detective series that takes place in New York and has been adapted a couple of times. In the mid-'80s, right after the book came out, the film 8 Million Ways to Die, starring Jeff Bridges, came and went and totally flopped. Weirdly, they moved that detective, Scudder. He became like an LA detective in that movie, which, having read the book now, New York is very integral to like the experience of reading one of these books. So I'm not really sure why they made that decision, but no one likes the movie anyway, so there you go. And then recently, within the last decade, A Walk Among the Tombstones with Liam Neeson is apparently a much more true to the source adaptation of that particular book. I've got a couple of his, actually. Speaking of, I've got A Walk Among the Tombstones, which I picked up relatively recently for very, very cheap. But I also have some books earlier in that Scudder series. As if you saw my crime book haul from a few weeks ago, I got When the Sacred Gem Mill Closes, which a lot of people say is Block's best book, which I think is like the 6th book in the series. And it's kind of like a turning point for the character, which we'll talk about in a second. And the book that followed immediately on, which is On the Cutting Edge. So I was going to read one of these, probably When the Sacred Gin Mill Closes, but I don't know. I just sort of decided at some point I wanted to just start from the beginning and see what that was like first, and see kind of if I was missing anything crucial in terms of information or anything about Scudder before I got to like book 6. It felt weird to jump right in the middle of the series, is what I'm trying to say. So instead, I read Sins of the Fathers by Block, which was his late 70s sort of debut novel for the Matthew Scudder character. Matthew Scudder, he is a private detective, though he's not licensed. He was a cop, but tragedy struck while on the job, and he quit the force and instead became a private investigator who, rather than getting paid to be officially an investigator for someone, he does favors for people, which is kind of a fun hook and is introduced pretty early on into the book. Sins of the Fathers is kind of your standard thriller noir mystery tale. It runs on the old structure where somebody comes to the detective, in this case, the father of a murdered young girl who, I say young girl, excuse me, young woman, a murdered young woman who the case has been closed, but he believes there's more to it. And surprise, surprise, there is. And the book kind of just follows Scudder as he jumps from person who knew her to another person who knew her to a person who knew her roommate to a family member of their roommate to the family member that hired him initially. And it kind of just bounces on and on and on. Not too dissimilar from one of these Philip Marlowe mysteries or a Lou Archer book. But there's a couple of things that I think make Sins of the Fathers and these Matthew Scudder stories that I've read so far stand out. And number one is, of course, the setting, which again makes the adaptation so bizarre to me that they would move it from New York at all. But a lot of these mysteries that I've read so far, they all have taken place in coastal towns. So you've got Philip Marlowe in Los Angeles and Hollywood. You've got Lou Archer, whose stories take place in a fictional suburban Southern California city, but it's basically like San Luis Obispo and Santa Monica and places like that. And then Hoke Mosley, the other detectives that I've read at least a little bit of, his work, Charles Willeford's work, it takes place in Miami. So again, a lot of coastal stuff. There are, of course, other detectives that take place in other cities. It's kind of fun, actually, to sit down and try to map out where everybody is within the United States. Other than Chester Himes' Harlem Detectives, I wasn't that aware of too many New York-based detectives. I mean, I knew about the Ed McBain stories, but Matthew Scudder, it was my first foray into a New York specific detective. And I think that adds just a different element. I mean, New York is a very different city from Los Angeles. If you've ever been to both cities, they're incomparable. I mean, New York is so claustrophobic and the buildings are so tall and it kind of smells bad in the summer. But it's also a cultural hotspot, whereas like Los Angeles is so spread out and beautiful, and there's always the sun shining, and you've got all these mountains and the beach, but also it's harder to find things to do sometimes. Like it's harder to find a good place to eat, whereas in New York, they're right around the corner, because it's just the density of everything. And I think that sort of contributes to the overall, to how people approach life in those cities. And it shows in the storytelling styles of someone like Chandler or McDonald versus someone like Lawrence Block. The other thing that really drew me into, what was I saying? The other thing that really drew me into this first book was Block's writing style. It's just easy to read, but it's also well written. I have this scale sometimes where I think about how difficult something is to read versus its sort of entertainment factor. My girlfriend and I talk about this all the time. And, the perfect mix is someone like a Stephen King or a George R.R. Martin or, I don't know, someone like Dan Simmons at his best. And like sometimes you can go too far on the entertainment side and the book is kind of like slop, like a Brandon Sanderson or I don't know, Rebecca Yarros or somebody like that. I don't know. So somebody that's like a Target favorite, right? But then on the other end of the scale, if something is so difficult to read, like an Ian Banks or a Steven Erikson, it can pull you away from your ability to just kind of get swept away in the story, especially if you find that you are constantly going back and like trying to figure out what did I just read? What just happened? And that can be like really distracting as a reader. To me, it's like a sliding scale. Like if I can listen to it on an audiobook and not feel like I'm being like I'm eating candy as a book, but I'm also not constantly feel like I'm doing homework to keep up with what just happened in the previous chapter. That's how I know I'm reading someone who's hitting right in that middle section. And I think Block falls right in there. I mean, to me, he's very similar to Elmore Leonard in that way, that it's just really good pulp crime fiction that doesn't feel like junk. And that's pretty hard to find. There's another approach too that I appreciated, though I think now someone might say it's probably like well-meaning like white liberal stuff. But in the book, there is a stretch where Scudder kind of hops around to all the different witnesses and some of his different leads that he utilizes. And he goes to a gay bar and he talks with the bartender there, and he utilizes him to learn more about the roommate of the murdered girl. And for a 70s book, I actually thought it was really sort of progressive and forward in how it approached the gay community and its his understanding and the character's understanding of the gay community. Some people might say now, oh, it's a bit too caricature-ish, but I think at least for its time, it was probably pretty forward leaning. Not to the degree of like Joseph Hansen, like an openly gay writer, but I think at least it was less problematic in its approach than a lot of other crime writers are. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but I feel like crime fiction is often the last bastion of kind of moving to the left. Like science fiction is very progressive. Sure, there's some like kind of right-wing cranks and stuff, but science fiction really looks towards future horizons, utopic solutions, and is a very sort of accepting genre for the most part, especially as it continued to grow and mature over the 20th century. And horror, I think, has sort of similar social concerns, so it kind of is like right behind science fiction in that degree. But fantasy and crime are always kind of on the back end. And for me, I think with fantasy, there's just other things going on in terms of like male power fantasies and stuff. But like with crime fiction, I guess it's sort of this alignment with Law and Order that sort of leads writers who have more of a conservative viewpoint towards things that probably don't age too well now, right? And I think there are a lot of things you would read, especially in regards to like opinions of women and opinions of people of color and like really nasty racist language that show up in a lot of crime books that wouldn't show up in other books of their own, of the same stripe, of the same era. Things are a lot better now, but it's just one of those things you always kind of prepare yourself for. So when you see a standout like Block, who kind of has more progressive bona fides, at least in this work that I've read, and actually kind of gives independent character agency to gay characters, to women. I think that in of itself is laudable, even if there are little specific things that we might say, I don't know about that. I think if there's a complaint I have about the book, it's that its eventual solution is pretty predictable. There's the character you think committed the crime is absolutely the character who committed the crime. And you'll be able to make that prediction pretty much right away if you're paying attention at all. That's not so bad. I mean, the truth of the matter is a lot of crime stories, and I think someone like Ed Brubaker has said this on podcasts before, or maybe in interviews, where to him, it's not the solution that matters, it's the journey of the investigator and as they get there. That's what matters, the journey, not the destination. But I just don't know that that's necessarily true. I kind of have always stood by this idea that if the destination wasn't worth reaching, was the trip worth taking? And I'm a little mixed on the ending of the book. I will say it has a very dark closing moment that I appreciated. It doesn't end exactly how a lot of like the movie version of this might end. It ends very, very dark and very morbidly. But I just kind of wish there might have been like just one little oomph, one little oomph. But overall, I do think The Sins of the Fathers is a very good first book in this series. I've already started reading the second book, A Time to Murder and Create, and it's got a great premise too, man. Like it's about a blackmailer who has been murdered, and he leaves a letter for Scudder, and he says, "Oh, it's one of these 3 guys I've been blackmailing. You got to find out which one murdered me." And I love that shit. I love that shit. So I'm really excited to go further into that and further into this series and finally read, you know, these books that I've actually bought. So I would give The Sins of the Fathers 4 stars. I think it is a great, easy breezy read, one that I could recommend to anybody that digs crime fiction. You know, brace yourself for some examples of the time in terms of language and content, but otherwise, I think it's as good as mid to late 70s crime fiction really can get. And boy, Matt Scudder, I see the hype. On the other hand, I read another James Crumley book. You may remember my Noir-vember video from November where I sung the praises of his masterwork, The Last Good Kiss. Now, Crumley, this was Crumley's second detective novel and his second of 2 detectives that he continuously wrote about throughout his career. Though, unlike Block, who wrote like 17 Matthew Scudder novels, it was kind of like this endless series and cash cow for him, Crumley only wrote a few books for each of these detectives, and I'm going to go through them really quickly just so you have them. But the general gist about Crumley, you know, you can get the biographical background in that video that I've linked above. But he wrote sort of the apex to me of like what good rural crime thrillers should be and good rural private detective stories should be. Most of his stories are set in like Montana or Texas, and some of them are like road stories, like The Last Good Kiss. So he wrote 2 different detective stories, though, 2 different detective series. So you had, in The Last Good Kiss, this is C.W. Shugru, okay, a former Vietnam vet turned bartender who also happens to do some private detective work. In The Wrong Case, the book I read this week, this stars Milo Milodragovitch, which is a hilarious name, and it sounds like Darren Barronman from Pool Man, like it's some kind of parodic thing. But no, it's a very serious book. And he is a former police officer in Montana who, after some corruption issues, ends up becoming a private investigator. Kind of similar to Matthew Scudder, Lawrence Block's Matthew Scudder, and also very similar to him. They both have significant drinking problems. Crumley's very first private detective novel was, of course, The Wrong Case, which I also have in this vintage contemporaries form. Sorry, forgive the sticker residue. I'm still trying to work that off. It's interesting that Crumley was actually in the vintage contemporaries line. I really love this livery. It's very early to mid 80s and very emblematic of a specific time. But like Crumley's work was highlighted along with like people like Raymond Carver and Jay McInerney and I can't remember, Joy Williams and a lot of other people like that, Charles Portis. And I think he was the only detective thriller writer who actually featured in any of that, though the lit-fic writer Stephen Erickson, not the fantasy guy, was also featured in this series eventually. So, and I think that's where some of his debut work occurred. So, yeah, you've got 2 versions of The Wrong Case. Because I'm a crazy person, I just buy the same version, different versions of the same book over and over again. Then after The Wrong Case, you had The Last Good Kiss, which is the first C.W. Shugru book. So the first Milo book, first C.W. book, and then he followed that up a few years later with the next Milo book, Dancing Bear, which I haven't read yet, but now having read The Wrong Case, I'm planning on going there. Also, this showed up in the Vintage Contemporaries line with a really cool cover. I like this kind of hapless-looking dude. I guess that's what Milo's supposed to look like. It wasn't what I imagined. I didn't think he would look like Lon Chaney or whatever, but yeah, so it goes. I don't have the Vintage Contemporaries version of The Last Good Kiss, unfortunately. I'm trying to get it, but it's really hard to find. But the hunt continues. So Crumley took like a really big break too in between writing that set of books and then writing his later set of books, and he went to Hollywood to write screenplays. One of those screenplays he wrote was actually an adaptation of the comic book Judge Dredd for the what would eventually be the Sylvester Stallone movie that came out in the mid-90s, that not very good movie with Sylvester Stallone and I think Armando Sante and Rob Schneider. Anyway, they didn't use his screenplay, which was based on this really cool story arc called The Curse Earth. But he did try his hand at becoming a Hollywood screenwriter. And you can sort of see how his writing lent itself to that. He was a very cinematic style writer, very discursive. He really broke with a lot of sort of the traditional storytelling molds that I think someone like Lawrence Block kind of, in his early work, was very beholden to. Crumley liked to wander, and he liked to just explore his characters a little deeper, which made me appreciate his work all the more. And when that failed, and unfortunately it did, he went on to write more books set in the Milo CW world. The first return to CW was The Mexican Tree Duck, which I just got this really nice first edition Mysterious Press over eBay, and it's in amazing shape. You can get these later James Crumley books very cheaply, like for like $5 plus shipping, you know, maybe even less depending on who you're getting it from. But this is the next CW book right after The Last Good Kiss, and something that I plan on reading very soon. And then afterwards, he decided to cross over both characters in the book Border Snakes, which was another Mysterious Press book. I guess he was with a different publisher in his earlier books, but went to Mysterious Press, who were the guys that sort of invigorated James Ellroy's career and run a tremendous bookshop that I'm excited to visit in New York in the next few weeks. But yeah, Border Snakes, Milo and CW meet. It's kind of funny because having read the first Milo book, I'm hard pressed to like find a different character voicing. They seem like the same guy to me, so I'm kind of curious what it's like when they meet. Maybe it's just like, you know, the Spider-Man meme, but still, this was the crossover. And then afterwards, he wrote one last book for both characters, The Final Country, which is his last Mysterious Press book with Milo, and then The Right Madness, the very last book he wrote before he died, James Crumley, I mean, and this was his last CW book. So, and this came out through Viking. So, yeah, not that many books. It's a pretty easy canon to collect. And the last thing I did get, and I got this very recently, was this hardcover omnibus of The Wrong Case, The Last Good Kiss, and Dancing Bear from Picador. It's really hard to get first edition hardcovers of the early Crumley works. They're very expensive. I was looking at a copy of The Wrong Case, and it was like $300. I was like, I'm not spending that much for a book that I own this many copies of. But this I got for about $40 from a very kind eBay seller. Thanks so much. If you're watching, you're probably not. And this was like a UK press that put all these together. And, you know, because the books aren't that long, it's not that long a book. So it's a nice collection to sort of have along with my other first edition hardcovers. And yeah, man, can't go wrong. But yeah, let's talk about The Wrong Case. So Milo Milodragovitch, I think I'm saying that right. I don't think it's Milo Milodragovitch. That's probably too Eastern European. I think it really is Milo Milodragovitch. So he's a guy that is an investigator, usually for couples that are on the verge of divorce or are looking to kind of get their things settled between one another. He does a lot of spying on errant husbands and wives. And when you're in the country, that's kind of like the major need for a private investigator, I guess, especially in that era. But in this story, much like the previous book, Sins of the Fathers, he's approached by the sister of someone who has disappeared. This woman, she believes something has happened to her brother, and she wants to find out where he is, if he can find him. She's received some calls from him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, stop me if you've heard this one before, but it's not quite what it seems. And it's funny, as many of these stories as you read, they all kind of start the same way. You know, you have a detective seated, gets hired by somebody who walks into their office, and then they're off to the races, jumping from family member to witness to connections they have to other law enforcement officers. What really sets the wrong case apart is how it colors in the world that Milo exists in. So you can imagine being a PI in Montana. It's kind of like, especially in a small town in Montana that's kind of growing, but not necessarily thriving. Everybody kind of knows everybody. And Crumley uses this to his advantage. So Milo works in an office that's just above a bar, and he has a number of assistants and colleagues of a sort that work with him, basically fellow drunks who he can like loop in to be his sort of eyes and ears on cases sometimes. It's a bit like Sherlock Holmes, actually, or the Shadow, that old pulp superhero who had his own little network of spies. Well, Milo's got his own, but they're very unreliable, basically. And the case itself kind of has a lot of back and forth and a little bit of dovetailing in between other cases that actually are surfacing during the course of the narrative. But what's most interesting about Crumley's writing style, and it's really apparent and at full bloom in The Last Good Kiss, but this is sort of the progenitor of that book, is that you can see how rambling he can be. And I don't use that as a pejorative. I use that as he's a writer who's trying to break the genre trappings as much as possible while still working within what a thriller audience is looking for. So what I mean to say is that while Milo might be in the middle of investigating this case, there will also be an entire chapter that just takes up small conversations he has with a woman he's having a sexual relationship with. And they're just snippets of conversation that have almost nothing to do with the rest of the story. It's just real life lived in pieces that feel like these little asides that I found very thrilling. Or, for example, there is an entire chapter that talks about sort of the background of his great-grandfather, who was this kind of legendary lawman of a sort who took down an even more infamous outlaw from the area. This comes up in the plot of the book a little bit, but then towards the end, there's just this full bloom aside that I think I was arrested by as I was reading it. And it's just one of these books that, unlike the Block novel, which I liked a lot, but I found a little predictable despite the journey being so fun to go on and really fulfilling as a single character piece, I found, now reading 2 Crumley books in a row, his mysteries are impossible to solve. And I mean that in a good way. I don't feel cheated. I don't feel like these things come out of nowhere. The evidence is in existence throughout the book and threaded. But when the resolutions come to bear, you are like, oh wow, I didn't see that coming, and that's good. And I maybe I should have, but I'm not a good enough detective. I'm not as good as Milo. I'm not as good as CW. So I think that in of itself is probably one of the best things I can recommend about Crumley's writing if you're just like looking for a good mystery writer. But if you're looking for something that's like a little bit more as well, I think that is what makes Crumley such an enticing and pleasing writer for someone who's looking for someone that can like kind of be a crossover between the sort of standard thriller airport fiction writer and lit fic. I guess you'd call that upmarket fiction is probably the best term. But even then, I don't think I've read much upmarket mystery fiction that reads this well. And I just think it's genuinely one of the best sets of books as a duo, The Wrong Case and The Last Good Kiss, that I've ever read, especially for late 70s rural crime fiction. I just don't know that you can beat it. I think the other thing that I find interesting about Crumley's approach is how he centers this kind of generational clash as the sort of underlying tension of the book. I mean, obviously the mystery is the main thing, and Milo's kind of personal journey that he undergoes throughout the 260 pages or whatever. But in the background, and eventually something that kind of becomes thrust to the foreground, is this idea that there are sort of there are like these devastating forces, or like perverting forces, that are like coming into their little sleepy burg, introducing things like drugs and the like. And you'll see a lot of references in the book to long hairs. So this centers the milieu that Crumley is writing in kind of a post Manson gang type story. And I think that is very important context to have, to sort of understand just what the sort of like general fears were of people in smaller rural communities, especially when horrifying stories like that broke. Obviously, like the Manson story was impactful in a broader way culturally. I mean, we still talk about it to this day, but in smaller, sleepier towns, this idea of like some big city dwellers with long hair and bare feet and a pocket full of marijuana, this idea that they would come and begin to start perverting their children and turning their children into drug addicts and stuff. That's something that I think the book kind of, it reflects a kind of viewpoint that I don't think is seen a lot in contemporary crime fiction. The other thing too is that I think the book also really vibrates on this frequency of the greatest generation versus baby boomers. And I think that's another thing that it's kind of similar to No Country for Old Men to a degree, where the sheriff is kind of bemoaning that turn of like, oh, I can't believe we see people with blue hair out in the streets, you know. The other thing that's really notable about The Wrong Case is just how alcoholic it is. It is very booze inflected. Now, Sins of the Fathers, Matthew Scudder, his character is sort of centered around this idea that he is a struggling alcoholic, though it doesn't really come to the forefront in that book. It's something that apparently builds over the course of this series. With The Wrong Case, Milo Milodragovitch is clearly an alcoholic, and he clearly has major problems. He blacks out constantly. He spends just as much time with his head in the toilet as he does with his nose to the ground investigating these cases. And this, I think, is a reflection of Crumley as a person who, if you ever get a chance to read interviews or read or see, there's a really great video with Otto Penzler, again, of the Mysterious Press and Mysterious Bookshop, where he talks about drinking with Crumley. And Crumley would drink champagne all night with him in this one story. It's great. And he was so drunk he couldn't stand for his next book signing that was in Houston the next day. So this is like a reflection of the kind of life that he lived, which I don't think is dissimilar from what Lawrence Block was doing in his own work, but it's just immediately in your face and so honest and truthful and naked in its observations around the vices of alcoholism. I mean, it's a great book. I don't think it's as good as The Last Good Kiss, but I'm giving it 4.5 stars. Only docking it just a little bit for my own confusion. Maybe in the coming months, as I think about it again, I might bump it up to 5. But, ooh, lordy, what a 1-2 punch. Anyway, those are the 2 books I've been reading. I swear to you, this will not become just like a crime channel. I'm just kind of in that headspace right now for whatever reason. Maybe that's like a sign of like me becoming a middle-aged guy. You start reading crime books all of a sudden. And there are like more that I want to read too, between Block and John D. MacDonald and Walter Mosley and a whole lot of others. So I don't know, but I promise you the next video, we'll be zeroing on some fantasy fiction instead. So, swords, dragons, we're going to get back to it, I promise. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe as always, and hey, keep on reading. Have a great weekend.